Good afternoon. Calling this meeting of the Growth and Natural Resources Committee to order. We have two items today. The first is the Environmental Advisory Board recommendations on solid waste and recycling, and the second is guidelines for commercial hillside development. We want to get started on the first?
Yeah, members of the committee, we're going to start with Stan Joseph, our Solid Waste Services Director. He's going to start with a similar kind of overview that he gave to the Environmental Advisory Board, just in terms of the backdrop of our services and operations that the EAB got ahead of the discussions and recommendations they made.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Stan Joseph, Solid Waste Services Director, City of Raleigh, and just want to talk a little bit today about the time that the Environmental Advisory Board spent in our department, some of the things we discussed, and I think Mr. Graham's going to come up later and talk a little bit more about it. So first of all, just as a general of what I'm going to talk about here in the next few minutes, I'll give you a quick overview of our Solid Waste Services Department and some of the services that we provide to the citizens of Raleigh. I want to touch on a very important and critical topic at this time, which is contamination and the evolution of the global recycling market. I want to talk about our yard waste center, what it looks like now, what it could and hopefully will look like in the future, and something that's come up occasionally, which is food waste and how we can potentially integrate that to increase our diversion as a city, and finally a few operational considerations of our department. We have about 220 employees at Solid Waste Services, and we provide a variety of services, including garbage and recycling, which is our core service. We provide a green service, which is our yard waste. We do leaf and limb pickup, as well as bag collection throughout the year. The leaf collection service is provided by the Transportation Department, which is seasonal from October until about March. In addition to that, we also provide bulky pickup and some special services, which includes our pickup in our central business district downtown, and we provide everything from Christmas tree collection after the holidays to used oil and used grease collection, electronic pickups, and we also have a pilot program that's ongoing by a vendor for to pick up textile recycling curbside. In and of itself, we cover a lot of the materials, more like material management at the curb, so we can increase diversion as much as we can. The hot topic in the area and globally is the evolution of the recycling industry. And you know, I won't go into too much detail unless you all have specific questions, but at the end of it all, United States has been recycling for some years, and certainly the city of Raleigh that converted from bin to curbside single stream source separated recycling many years ago. And it has been a successful program. We would collect recycling at the curb, we would take it to a processing facility, it would be processed and then marketed and sold. At one point, 8-10 years ago, it was a business that generated revenue for the city. We shipped a lot of it overseas. The majority of it was shipped overseas to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and other countries. However, there has been significant global changes that has caused those countries to implement certain bans that has flooded the United States with the market that normally went overseas and is now stateside, which has affected supply and demand and has really what it is a saturated market, and the price that we used to collect for selling 1 ton of single stream recycling has dropped significantly. Just to illustrate that, if you look historically at what is called the weighted average price, and the weighted average price is essentially what you can take your aluminum, your cardboard, your mixed paper, your plastics, bale it all up in a ton after it's separated, and sell it for, as far as individually, and then you get the weighted average price for 1 ton of single stream recycling.
So Stan, can I just ask real quick? I was going to ask about the different streams. How it sounds like you're, as a conglomerate, all the different types. I mean, you know, hearing cardboard was the big issue, the biggest issue of not being able to go overseas to China, but we look at this from a sort of all the streams put together? Or commingled, thank you. Or how are you looking at it?
So I think that when we look at it for the purposes of the weighted average price, we look at all of the single stream material that's in there, which includes mixed paper, cardboard, aluminum, steel, all of it. The largest portion of the stream, probably 60 to 70% of it, is typically mixed paper and cardboard, which is the bulk of what we ship overseas. We also did ship plastics as well. The smallest is obviously metals and aluminum. But when we look at the weighted average price, we do look at all single stream material.
For committee members, just background that's been shared with prior councils, we do rely on a relationship with Sunoco, who serves as our MRF. And so part of the reason this is significant is those are some of the triggers and data points that our contract is built around.
Exactly. So when you look in, as far back as April 11th, most processors could sell 1 ton of single-stream recycling at a weighted average price of $140 per ton. When you look at the last known that we calculated, which is December 2019, it was selling at right over $20 a ton. That's a significant difference. The dotted line is a very important line. The dotted line is typically, on average in the industry, what it costs to process 1 ton of recyclables. That's their operating costs. So as you can see, many recycling facilities throughout the United States and Canada have been operating at a loss for many years, and many of them have closed. I think the larger recycle processing facilities like Waste Management, the Sunocos who own their own mills, and some of the larger ones like GFL are continuing to operate, but they are kind of changing their business model in order to sustain recycling for the long term.
What percentage of a ton of recycled material is actually reused?
I think that varies from processing plant to processing plant. I think I could tell you confidently, or with confidence, that the average residual, what is left over from a ton of recyclables, on average in the industry throughout the United States, is between 10 and 17%. So I think you can make an assumption that probably about 90 to 80% of it is processed and turned back in some manner.
Okay.
Okay. So I think, one of the things that processors are looking at to combat this evolution of the industry is that loads that were sent to China and Pakistan are being rejected and sent back to the United States on their own dime, and a large reason for it was contamination. Now, although the ban created almost an unattainable contamination level of less than 1%, I think that when things were good in the recycling industry, residue just didn't seem to matter that much because everyone was making a lot of money. Now we recognize that not only is the ban being restrictive, but all along the business model, we should have been focusing on contamination to clean that up. And so as a result of the ban and trying to produce more quality material, the industry as a whole is looking at contamination as an area that they can improve. And so is the city of Raleigh. This is just lists some things that are going on in the region. We've had many regional meetings, everyone from TJ Cog to MRF Shed meetings to regional solid waste directors getting together to talk about how we can deal with this shift in the recycling industry and how we can sustain recycling long term. And these are just a few of the organizations that are addressing that. My next topic I'd like to talk about is our solid waste yard waste center. We have a closed landfill, and right next to the closed landfill is our yard waste center, where we take in the green waste from the city as well as city residents from our trucks that collect it, and also commercial green waste that comes in from landscapers and commercial businesses. To be transparent about it, I think for many, many years we've been doing that, and as a result of that, we had stockpiled a lot of debris throughout several hurricanes and throughout the curbside program, and we never really came up with a strategy to remove that debris and either process it or revamp the way we do it. I think eventually we were going to run out of space. I think, we're getting to the point where that is of concern for us. And this picture here kind of shows what our stockpile was in 2002, which is the yellow areas that's on here. And in 2017, as you can see, those areas have turned to red. And the dotted lines are what used to be the yellow areas. So as you can see, that's a significant stockpile. And I'm going to figure out how to clear this because I always have a problem doing that. There we go. And so I think we're coming up with a plan to, number one, remove that debris. So for two reasons. Number one, it's out of compliance, and we have to remove it so we can continue to operate and continue to keep our yard waste center open so we can maintain the city's greenways. But the second reason is that we would like to restructure our organization or the way we organize our yard waste center so we can integrate what we call a better workflow. Right now it's very crowded with limited space to work. At times a lot of vehicles are there. We want to make sure our residents have a safe place to come around and drop off and pick up mulch during the season. But also because at some point we would like to integrate compost and food waste into our process. But the only way we can do that is restructuring the way we do things down there, and in order to do that we need space. I think this just gives a few facts about the North Carolina DEQ compliance as far as the Yard Waste Center. We were cited back a couple years ago for the pile being too large, and we came up with a mitigation plan that DEQ accepted, and we are still on track for that. At the end of the day, what we were doing, we were not processing out as much as we could intake, and now we've made some significant improvements with council support to move in that direction.
What's the negative environmental impact of having too much yard waste in one place?
I think that yard waste is typically supposed to go into permitted areas. So you have a landfill that's lined, and you can put garbage in it, and you have an area that should be permitted to accept yard waste. It's not designed to be stored long-term in one location unless it's permitted. Although we're permitted to operate as a yard waste center there, it's not permitted as a storage area or an area that, like a landfill that's lined, that it can be properly disposed of. I think the downside of storing it the way we have been storing it for so many years is just simply the fact that we don't have the space to do it. And eventually we will run out of space and we can't operate.
I mean, is it stored on impervious surface, like a hard surface, or is it not sort of biodegrading as it's sitting there altogether? I mean, I'm intrigued that it's seen as environmentally negative. That
Yeah.
I just think of leaves and branches and woody material sitting there. That's what it does when you compost, basically, sort of. Anyway,
Yeah,
but unless it's a impervious surface where it's not actually be able to go back into the ground.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you kind of think about a farmland or just stuff sticking in the forest. I think based on DEQ standards, when you store debris like that, whether it's storm debris or even in a yard waste center, they have certain restrictions on the height and they have certain restrictions on the diameter. And based on those restrictions, we were above those standards. I want to talk a little bit about the city approach to food waste. I think that right now, food waste, and not just in the city of Raleigh, but many municipalities throughout North Carolina, is one of those items that I feel like people would really love to capture because there's so much positive use to it to go full cycle in what we call diversion. I think it's a difficult challenge, and it's challenging because there are not many, the infrastructure is not in place to process food waste and turn it into a viable type of compost and fertilizer. But I think it's growing in North Carolina significantly, and I think we need to keep that on the cutting edge of our diversion as we move forward in our environmental standards. I think that it's also costly to collect, and because there's not a lot of places that process it, that's sometimes an impediment to implementing it. In our building, we are trying to get to a mission of zero waste, and one of the things that we do is we pay a food compost facility that really he's only the main one in this area. What's the name of it? Compost Now, that operates in this area, Justin, that does that service, and we have him come in because we have a lot of training classes in our facility that we cater food to, and he collects our food waste. Long term, it is my belief that we can implement some sort of compost or food waste program in the city, whether it be in a centralized collection area or maybe even curbside. But I think before we do that, one of the things I would like to get to is collecting our yard waste or our green waste with carts. If we are able to do that, then it would be so much easier, like many municipalities in the Midwest and the West Coast that have integrated food waste into their green waste. So it's kind of a tiered type system. We have to organize and control our yard waste center in order to accommodate it and make best use of it. The other part of it is we've got to remodel the way that we currently collect green waste, curbside, and residential right now. So it is something we are shooting for, but I think it's a few years away, if I'm being realistic about it. But I think there is certainly some opportunities there for food waste curbside. Our sustainable vehicle fleet, I think that we have set a goal for our department to be 25% CNG by the year 2025. I think it's aggressive, but I'm a firm believer in compressed natural gas. In the private sector, we operate a lot of compressed natural vehicles in the city of Charlotte and the city of Greensboro. It's so cleaner, it's quieter, the maintenance cost is lower, and I think the return on investment is certainly worth it, not to mention just the clean air. It's less, it's probably 5 to 10% of what you would get with a non-B20 diesel vehicle. So we have set some aggressive goals for us. I think part of that is, as we start integrating compressed natural gas into our vehicle fleet, I think we need to build the infrastructure to sustain a full fleet of CNG vehicles. And so we've developed that into a long-term capital improvement plan in our facility between us and Vehicle Fleet Services. And I think that's just kind of a overview of some of the things that we discussed during the EAB. I'm sure that Graham's going to come up here and talk a little bit more detail on it, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yes, yard waste, maybe the term we need to think about using a different term, because I know some towns and cities are trying to at least educate their residents about maybe you don't need to take this off of your property. There are things you could do with it on your property, composting, et cetera, but using it in your natural areas, et cetera. So I don't know if we had any outreach efforts on like that. And then food waste the same way. I know a lot of us have compost where we just compost our, whatever we can compost food wise, and just, the whole back to the land. Everybody has gardens, et cetera. Using that, chicken feed, et cetera. Is there any educational outreach efforts for people to maybe rethink the way they use their so-called yard waste and food waste?
I think that we have every opportunity we get to speak to citizens. We have an education and outreach section. I think we partner up with Sunoco a lot. We don't just talk about the curbside recycling. A lot of people do ask about that. They ask about our yard waste and what are we doing on food waste. We certainly provide areas that they can find information on how they can kind of DIY it and process. I do composting in my backyard. But as far as a formal program, I don't think so. But we certainly discussed that in the EAB, and that is something that we're going to be partnering with the EAB and Recycle Partnership about getting some of that kind of education out.
That'd be great. Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Back to the global recycling market. What? I know this continues to evolve and change, but what is there a plan now, or is it kind of in a wait and see about ensuring that we continue to have a viable recycling program in the city?
Well, I think during our last conversations, obviously it's something that it's time sensitive and we have to act quickly on it. I think I'll be coming back to talk to council in March timeframe to discuss more in detail how we as a city can deal with it and sustain recycling. So we have several options we'll be laying out for everyone.
Good. All right. Look forward to hearing it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Joseph. Yeah, and now we have Graham Smith, who is the chair of the Environmental Advisory Board.
Let's go. Sorry about this. Also like to point out that Linda Watson and Justin Sinkbill are both here. I think that's it from our EAB. We have 9 members on the board, and those two were critically important in writing the recycling report with some of their passions that they have. Linda in the food world, and then Justin running Compost Now. So we were very happy to have their contributions. So on our work plan last year, and it's still on our work plan this year, but last year it was the number one item. It was to review and evaluate recycling programs with a focus on organics recycling, specific challenges related to other recycling streams. So we started with this idea of what organics meant and what did it look like in the city, what did Stan mean by it, what did it mean from Solid Waste Services. And this came through at the bottom there. You'll see the Solid Waste Reduction Task Force from several years ago referred assessing the development of an organics food waste, didn't mean wasted, waste diversion strategy to the Environmental Advisory Board. So it was sent to us, referred to us by this task force, and we didn't really get to it in fiscal year 2018. We got to it in 2019, and we made it a priority last year. And it does work with the strategic plan, several categories here. And this is just kind of our overall goal and approach. We listened, learned, researched. We spent those first 3 months working with Stan and trying to figure out how he operated the facilities, what was going on there. Then we discussed a lot, and then we did take quite a time to write it with Linda and Justin taking lead on that, and myself and others, kind of Cindy and staff working on that, molding that into what the outcomes may be. We discussed it again. We had a lot of conversation, and then we finalized a report. And we wanted to have some actionable items and recommendations in that report. So, in January 2019, we did 3 months there out visiting. We focused on solid waste in January. Actually went out there and had our meetings out on site. So Stan hosted us while the focus was learning about recycling and the programs there. We also conducted our standard meetings out there. And the focus in January was solid waste. And February was recycling. Great artwork out there, talking about all the things you can recycle. So that was great. We did go to the Sunoco facility, which is nearby. We did leave the building and go on a field trip. And then in March, we went on a field trip to the yard waste facility and got to see some of the piles of leaf collection. And I want to say one of these 2 piles may have just been 2017. Like, that's the staggering amount. This looks, I mean, it's crazy out there. That was just 1 year's worth of leaves. And so Stan's got a really good program of windrowing stuff and building that. David, Councilor Knight, you had mentioned the idea of how to get it to turn to compost. So he's really starting to work that and create some windrows out there and get it down into smaller piles so it composts faster. But there's still a lot of other yard waste that's out there that's truly woody yard waste. And so the leaf compost is turning much quicker to usable form. The other stuff has to be ground up in other measures. We focused on these 5 challenges, and maybe I can clear this thing because how do I get off of this thing? Oh, I don't want that. There we go, look at that. 5 major challenges, which really coincide with what Stan just put up there. Contamination, global recycling market, storage space for the yard waste, what is the appropriate approach to food waste, and what are the future operational considerations. So we looked at these as challenges, and we wanted to kind of outline our understanding of them. We're not in the solid waste industry. We're folks that we're trying to learn and catch up to speed, but working with what we understood and kind of where our background was coming from, we wanted to come out with some recommendations as well. You'll see in the report, which you guys have, and sorry, this is very small, but this is challenge one. These are the recommendations of, to kind of deal with challenge one, the contamination. As Stan alluded to, and kind of in his presentation, they blended, contamination and global recycling markets are almost one and the same in a lot of ways, so there's a lot of crossover there. And some of these things are starting to happen. Like one thing we, started to look at was Raleigh and Sunoco, making sure they're really talking about current market conditions. There was a current contract that was just brought back up because of some contract conditions that came out by Sunoco seeing what was going on in the glass market. There's been some upgrades in the website and the downloadable materials. They're not all the way there, but there have been some upgrades recently on what could be graphically represented, what could be recycled, could be clear to the citizens. So we started to talk about how it's clear to citizens, how it's clear to businesses, how education and engagement would work, what types of posters and other educations would work, so that removing simple as Christmas tree lights and decorations need to be removed before you're putting them out. And I think Stan does a lot of that, but maybe it's in the water bill or something like that. So what other mechanisms of engagement and education could happen? So, or making sure people are aware of all of these things that may affect the use of the product on the other end. We asked Sunoco, they have a great little tour group, they have a great little tour guide. It is a tough facility to visit. I mean, people are working incredibly hard in that facility, in incredibly tough conditions. It's hot and cold, but in the little tour room, they have a display, and it's maybe not most up to date. So we just wanted to there's just clarity on what you could recycle, what you can't recycle. It's that whole, from a citizen standpoint, do we know what we can do and can we not do? We all are wish cyclers. We want to put everything into recycling if possible, but we don't want to screw up the stream and contaminate it. So that's part of this challenge with contamination. If possible, continue to promote the reduction of single-use plastic bags for business operations. We know there's some state laws that affect that possibly, but the single-use plastic bags was a topic of conversation. There is this also the idea of engaging a study about multi-stream recycling opportunities. Very similar to that, the global recycling markets. We talked about engagement, education, a study for some multi-stream recycling opportunities. And then RDAG, I don't know how you say that, out in Wilson, they're the one company, as I understand it, that takes the glass in the state, at least where we ship it. So you have an hour drive glass. It's very expensive. It's the heaviest weight recyclable, and trucking costs are very expensive. So to get it to Wilson, what does that look like? And that's really flipping the numbers. When you start to look at that weighted average, the costs are really significantly, they're costing the city money. So consider proactively working. Stan mentioned some of these things that are happening right now, regional economic development entities, to talk about how to talk about contamination and global recycling market challenges. But we even say, well, can you maybe recruit another recycling facility to the city or region? How do you better support some things? Invest in contamination reduction awareness, because once again, that makes our recycling material more available to the global markets. And then promote awareness of recycled materials. Going out and seeing what you walk into Wilder's Grove and you see the recycled materials right on the wall, and you see them at your feet, and you see them on the walls, and you see them all around you, and you're like, this was done 10 years ago, and this is pretty cool. Just think about where the market's gone with all the recycled materials, what you could do with glass, what you could do with cement mixes, what you can do with a lot of different textiles and other things. So it's how do you promote those ideas of what people can use and how the market can support that. From storage space for yard waste, Stan had some great diagrams up there. He showed the kind of physical requirements and the challenges he's got. We would really like to, right off the bat, encourage cooperation between city departments to use the city-provided compost mulch and wood chips. There have been some challenges with some of the departments because I think the knock was the quality wasn't known. And so Stan's hired a yard waste center director. He's got a really good handle on it. He's certifying tests, and we want to make sure those tests stay up to date, and he has all the support he has to basically bring those products to market. So the commercial landscapers and the public works and parks departments here are comfortable using the product. It's free, readily available. So we talk about that quite a bit in the first few items there. It is available to be free for nonprofits and community gardens. We want those nonprofits and community gardens to actually know that it's free. So the products from there are free. So making sure that they know that. And the challenge right now is to getting it off the site. So how do we get it from the site to the people that possibly would benefit from it? So one thought was, could you deliver large truckloads of it to community centers or centralized city locations on certain days and announce that so people could come and get smaller collections of it? It's hard for certain people to go out and say, yeah, I'm going to make a commitment to go rent a pickup truck and head out there, or to pay somebody to haul 10 yards to your house when you may only need a couple yards. Explore alternative methods for compost pickup to assist with that. So that's the same kind of thing. How can you get the product? If we're trying to get rid of 400,000 cubic yards of product, how can we get it to the market? That's really in the mindset we're trying to think, so that the yard waste center can work efficiently. Meanwhile, benefit all the citizens of Raleigh. So let's see. We'll explore the use of paper leaf bags on a weekly basis for curbside yard debris work. This would, paper leaf bags are encouraged for wood and kind of shrub waste, but you could also put it in clear plastic bags and have it taken to. So maybe we really push for the paper leaf bags, but this could also be used for the leaf collection instead of the trucks that have to suck things up, and sometimes they suck a brick up instead of just leaves. Like, there's stuff in the sidewalk, in the right of way, that gets into those trucks. Sometimes it may mess things up. How can we make that process happen a little more efficiently? Explore the use of a city truck or private contracted hauling company to actually provide delivery service out from the yard waste service center. So how can we, once again, get the product out to the market? And then can we push to get the leaves collected before Christmas so that some of the Christmas stuff isn't mixed in there? And then we kind of support the idea of operational efficiencies. What does a workflow look like if that's an in-house consultant, at-a-house consultant, to help Stan kind of figure out what's the best way to maximize what land he has and how he can improve processes, not just a land study, but more about processes. And the last item is that acquire additional land as a possible option. So 2 more challenges. This is the food waste challenge. Encourage the use of existing private vendor food composting services and use them for City of Raleigh events. So really push that out. I think there's some stuff happening behind the scenes at the Convention Center and Performing Arts Center, but how does it become a front side known entity when you're there as a visitor? Is it worthwhile doing that? Is there benefit to that? Educate the public about the benefits of food waste composting. That's a lot of what you guys just asked Stan about that. How do we educate people of doing it on site or giving it to the city entity? Look at soliciting possibly private vendor partners for a 2 to 3 year pilot program. And this is similar to the curbside textile, the orange bags that we all have. That was a private vendor that came to the city and said, we'll do X for you. We'll look at this program in partnership with you. They're looking at it as a money-making partnership. Do we go private and test it out? Or the next item says, next bullet says, we look at city-provided services. So testing one of those 2 pilots out, or testing both pilots out, and seeing how that works. But we really think that, as Stan alluded to, food waste has become, it's the norm now. So it's not, composting is kind of standard operating procedure in a lot of homes in Raleigh, and it's a thought process, at least in a lot of people's mindset. So how do we take advantage of that kind of becoming more in the forefront? And then review the operations of the yard waste center and kind of how does it all work with the yard waste, the other organic matter, possibly acquiring additional land. And the last item, future operational considerations. We encourage you guys to visit all of the facilities we visited, because it was eye-opening. Wilders Grove and seeing the fleet and the guys and the staff work there, and then going into the Sunoco recycling facility and seeing the yard waste piles and seeing what's happening there. It is an eye-opening, and the scale of the operation is significant. And then we did like what staff did earlier this summer, or last summer. Some of the hotter summer months, we all got a message saying they rolled to 6:30 in the morning, so the trucks were leaving a little earlier, maybe even earlier for that. Those hot summer months are tough doing the job that they have to do. We're thinking about workers' conditions. We'd love to see the fleet consider switching to all electric vehicles. I certainly understand the financial challenges of that, and Stan's going to, that 25% goal for compressed natural gas by 2025. but is there any way to kind of continue to study what it would take to get there faster, or to some alternative or all-electric fleet vehicles? Looking at providing a safe working environment for all solid waste services employees, because some of what they're doing out there is backbreaking work in some very tough conditions. Looking at safe and best practices for those who live in dense neighborhoods where you're affected by particulate drift and smells and emissions. We have a lot more people living downtown. Waste downtown obviously is a challenge. So that one thing feeds another, and unfortunately it may not be a positive outcome. So we want to make sure that all that's continued to be thought about. And then also those who live nearby the solid waste facility, the closed landfill. There are several residences nearby on the east side of the Yard Waste Center. I want to make sure that Stan continues to use best practices and safety protocols and monitoring to ensure that they have a good life there and their home is not affected. We like the idea of including, I think it's important, the social justice analysis and community engagement efforts are integrated into the review of any service expansion, any workplace improvements, any route management. We tend to think that's happening across the city. And a lot of when you talk about planning studies, transportation efforts, want to make sure that's integrated into what solid waste is doing, given that they have a lot of trucks out on the street and a lot of people out in the community. So that's it, I think. That's it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Do
Questions?
committee members have any questions?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Did you look at waste generated by commercial as opposed, I know you looked at residential, but about, composting amongst our restaurants and what could be done there? Because for example, how much food waste is actually generated by restaurants as opposed to residential?
We didn't get into the data a lot on any of this per se. We were using the data that was provided to us. We talked about in several of our comments, I think, the idea of an educational process for that. Knowing what we're starting to learn about the convention center, there's a lot of food waste being composted and recycled back of house right now. So that was exciting to hear. And just from an operational standpoint, we understand that restaurants, commercial vendors, it's easier to do in the kitchen than it is to do on the front side. And then you're having people sort it versus somewhat qualified kitchen staff sorting it and understanding it, and kind of that's their daily job. So it's an easier, from a financial standpoint, and just the bulk and what you're getting out of it, you're going to get more out of the kitchen side. But we haven't dove into the impacts of that versus residential now. But I think there's significant opportunity given the amount of restaurants. Yes.
Just want to say, thank y'all I like this comprehensive approach to I think the 5 challenges that y'all have laid out there, and working obviously with the different divisions that are impacted and affected and are going to be partnering with y'all and us as we figure out how to go about this, and then prioritizing or looking at this incrementally, how we can go about taking on some of the pieces of this. So I think that's a good approach, and I look forward to working with y'all as the new council liaison. Thanks.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank y'all so much for doing this over the past year. I really appreciate you coming in and being here for our presentation as well to help us understand a little bit more and dig into what your recommendations were. I've got one point and then one question for staff. I have really appreciated, Mr. Joseph, since you got here about a year ago, how much you have dove into all of our challenges and really risen to the occasion. And I see even some of these recommendations here, I know that you've already got your mind fully wrapped around and will just take some time to implement. So I do rest assured that some of this stuff is already in the works. One of the things that stands out to me as a recommendation is a lot around education and awareness, kind of on all fronts. And so to that point, we're doing a lot on social media these days, but one of my favorite, this is somewhat silly, but very serious to me, one of my favorite Twitter handles is Raleigh Water, and the great information that they're putting out about all matters, water and waste in our city. And I think there's good content created there, and then it's further dispersed through our other social medias, the other cities' social medias. And I'm wondering, is that something that our solid waste department already has or uses, and could that be something we consider
I think Stan can come if there's more to add. We do have staff related to communication and education and outreach within solid waste, and I think certainly you will have a presentation, a foreshadowing of the budget, and that's certainly something that Stan could speak to in a little bit greater detail, what the resources are that are devoted there. He can probably describe to you briefly the level of staffing and focus here today too as well.
Yeah, I do agree. I think that's a big component of it. There's a lot of changes going on, not just in recycling, but in solid waste. And if we're going to propel changes and be innovative and sustainable, we need to be transparent about it and solicit input and feedback. I think that's one area that we have that's a big opportunity for us, and I think we're going to take advantage of it. When I think about the apps out there like Nextdoor, Twitter, Facebook, all of those. We actually have combined an FTE to focus specific on that. Amanda Astor is moving into a different position where she'll be working with our communications folks to ramp that up. We don't currently have our own handle, if you will, like Raleigh Water. But in our branding process, we're going to be going there. So I think we're going to take every opportunity we have to take advantage of that. I will say one thing. I'm a fan of outreach and education. I think that it's going to help a lot with the changes that we may have to make now and maybe very quickly in the future to adapt to the evolution of the recycling industry. But I will say that with outreach and education, what is going to have to come with it is a certain level of an enforcement component to make sure, because it's such a critical thing, that the folks that are trying to do the right thing when they recycle, and we are implementing the education component, that we also have enforcement ordinances and stuff that back up the things that are really degrading the ability to process recyclables effectively.
Yeah,
So.
great. Thank you. Thank you, and good luck with that, too. And I think, Mr. Joseph, the other thing that kind of weighs on me is all of the challenges in front of us and the cost that those may entail. So I look forward to hearing more in March and the coming months as we figure out our budget. So thank you. Any other comments or questions from committee? Okay. Thank y'all. And thanks to our Environmental Advisory Board members for being here today.
So
Thank
a
you.
bit of housekeeping. I believe at this point you're deferring future action to your budget process in terms of any resources. Somebody just may want to make a motion to report this back out, I think with a recommendation of no action at this time.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Thank you so much. You're such a good trader.
Do we need to make a note about the meeting?
So we're not there. So we have one more item, and I'm going to let Tansy help us with this one.
Yeah.
Well,
So
yes.
So your next item is just an overview of your hillside development recommendations. This was a recent study that was completed by the planning department, and we've got Joe Michael at the podium.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Joe Michael. I manage the Urban Design Center with Planning and Development. Just a little background that Tansy alluded to. This is a project from the Planning Department's work plan. It's staff initiated. We worked with a consultant on this. And it was developed after a recognition of a few years of reviewing plans under the new UDO that perhaps the regulations didn't adequately take into account sloping sites and sites with topography. And so we want to make sure that the UDO isn't negatively impacting the public realm. So I'll just start with a couple of reference images. The one on the left is a more historic neighborhood on a hill. The one on the right, a more contemporary example. To create walkable, pedestrian-oriented neighborhoods, I think we need to understand why the image on the left is very unlikely to occur or be built today, and what in our code might be keeping us from seeing strategies like the one on the right. So simply stated, Raleigh needs and deserves a great public realm, and again, those regulations that we have may not always be achieving that goal. So the UDO needs updated regulations to encompass slope sites and particularly flexibility to create better design outcomes. And to ensure quality public realm, we want to look to a combination of changes that clarify intent, reaffirm that intent, or add new regulations. So if the goal is to improve the condition of development of the public realm, we started with a process. What are the issues? Do all of these issues warrant new regulations? If so, what are the options that we have? And what are the potential impacts of those? The process was we worked with the consultants, Code Studio. They looked to other peer cities to identify best practices. We developed policy proposals. We looked at site-specific plans to see how regulations would apply to them. We conducted work sessions with the Appearance Commission, Planning Commission, and DSAC after a draft set of recommendations had been developed. We had also a public meeting, public workshop. After receiving comment on that from those groups, we revised our draft guidelines, which is what we are talking about today. So we divided into these categories that have been identified. I'll go through each one. We can talk about kind of what was the problem that we identified with each one of these, what were the proposals, touch on the impacts, and then finally what would be staff recommendation. And so we can take questions as we go through these, or wait till the end when we've got a recommendation. We've also, at the end of the presentation, we have a summary of all the recommendations if we want to wait till the end. So I'll let you decide. So first, measurement of height. So this is kind of the clearest one that I think we have challenges with. So we refer to this image a lot because this building is a really good example of commercial development on a sloped site. But I think it's something that we would not see today because of what the UDO is either regulating or not incentivizing. So you can see the active ground floor at the lower level here. We see the massing, which terraces down and steps with topography. If we look at this image, which we photoshopped to show kind of what we would expect to see today, because height is primarily measured in feet and stories, with stories being the development component of that, the amount of allowable development areas by floors, we get kind of a pancake style development where we're trying to maximize those floors. So if this were a zoning district of 3 stories, this is how we would count stories. We would likely not see the lower level be used. Active uses are currently not allowed, so it would have to be uses of parking or something like that. So likely we would see some sort of foundation wall condition. So compare that to what is built in this reference image. We wouldn't see this version get built because, one, you're either sacrificing developable area, or we would be exceeding the allowable stories. So this is how we would count this building today for height if this were in Raleigh. Again, it would either exceed the number of stories allowed if it was in a 3-story zone. If it were in a 4-story zone, we likely wouldn't see the kind of terrace down because that would be sacrificing development area. So if we want to allow this sort of development to occur, we need to add flexibility. So one way we are talking about that is through being able to divide up measurement of height, measurement of feet and stories into zones. So essentially designers will be able to split their building into zones for height and story. This would not replace how we currently measure height. It would just be an additional option to be able to do that. The second option that we have looked at is, we heard a lot about this in our stakeholder meetings, which would be to allow for active use of an additional half story at the lower level. So essentially this would be looking to reverse that portion of the attics and basements tax change. So we've got kind of these varying options. We've current UDO outcomes and what we're likely to expect, adding flexibility or allowing that additional half story. The impacts are obviously potential for more intensity of use, both in development and in greater activation of the sidewalk level. With anything, there's always the potential increase for building cost, building more complicated buildings, adding more developable area increases cost. And particularly for number 2, there is the perception that a building might be out of context. So a 3-story zoning looks like a 4-story building. So staff recommendations, we think option 1 is would be a good thing to incorporate into the UDO. So we would recommend adopting a text change for that, and consider allowing for the half-story option 2. So we can stop here, and if you need any questions, or we can continue.
I'm going to check in with my committee members here. I'm also recognizing time, and that there's a lot in this.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot. Thank you. Do folks want to kind of go through each of these right now, or do we want to figure out a path for how so I'm trying to remember how many of these. There's height, there's
6.
Yep, height, transparency, blank foundation wall, retaining walls, transition zones, and pedestrian access. So I'm wondering if we want to kind of get a handle on how we're going to get this information, understand the recommendations, and move forward on each of these. If that's something, I don't think we can tackle all of them today. So looking to committee members' thoughts or thoughts on how to handle this. Mr. Martin.
From my understanding, is by taking these one at a time and making decisions, would it be best for you if we made decisions at once? As in, we could hear 1 or 2 today and hold decision making, and then hear more at a later meeting and then decide what we want to do? Or does it not necessarily matter, given the text changes, if we decide today, like this, what you've proposed today, for instance, makes sense to me, but I'm not sure, given the entirety of what the 6, options that we need to get through?
Joe, maybe let me jump in here. So I think there's no bad way for you to have this conversation. I think in terms of the actual staff work to draft and implement a text change, we would want a consensus view of that. Some of these, the ordinance language are going to have interrelationships amongst them. So we would want to actually do that drafting together. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't have your policy discussion incrementally across a number of meetings and then report out the sum of those pieces together. So we've done previous work that way, and we can certainly, if you provide some partial feedback today, we can certainly keep track of that, and then in future meetings kind of help you understand the accumulation of the policy work. We could also certainly just walk through each of these today for your understanding without any expectation of any decisions or feedback today. There's no particular timetable or any expectation from the staff that you'd give direction on these today, if that's helpful.
Mr. Snyder, Mr. Cox, do you all have an opinion?
Well, my impression is, first of all, tall buildings are good. We achieve greater density that way. I'm troubled by these massive buildings that take up what look like at least 2 or 3 blocks on the street, and it makes it difficult. It's just difficult to get around. I mean, you have a long way to walk. There's no real pedestrian access. I think on slopes like this and for lengths of buildings like this, that we need to modify our UDO to break these buildings up into smaller buildings with some open space between the buildings to make it more human scale and more desirable in the long run. I mean, to me, it looks like a warehouse, and particularly option number 2. So those are my observations.
Well, it's kind of hard for me to tell that from looking at that picture. I mean, it fits on the block it's on, but that we can continue to have those conversations. Just one question. The 6 issues, are those all separate text changes? Is that why they're separated out?
No, so I think we've just summarized kind of contextually the way you would experience
Okay.
the different impacts. Again, I think when you authorize the text change, you'd authorize a text change to accomplish these goals together.
Okay.
It's the
Hill side. Okay, so if that's the case, then maybe, I don't know, I would suggest going through them all, and then I don't think we'll have time to finish today, and then coming back and talking about it as a sort of collectively or all together as one text change.
And do you all want to go through the whole thing right now, or do you want to do it at a future meeting, likely looking at April? Because we already know what's on our March agenda. I'm going to hold it till April.
Yeah, it'll be fine.
So the other thing I'd like to add is I am in no way, and I'm speaking only for myself, an expert in any of these matters, and I'm wondering if it's appropriate to ask for input from some of our stakeholders while we don't do anything with this item and it just sits here in committee for 2 months. And would it be appropriate to ask planning staff to go meet with DSAC one more time? And I know I've already heard a couple folks' concerns about some of these items, and so if some of that could be worked out with folks who will be trying to implement new changes on the ground, and then come back and we can start to really dive into it and maybe have a whole meeting just on this topic. With that?
Yeah, we can certainly reach out and ask for some participation between now and then to get some additional feedback in terms of how the industry experts might react to some of these suggestions.
And then we would still have time with it before we're sending it anywhere else. Does the committee feel good about that, Mr. Cox? I see these two nodding, but,
Yes.
okay, great. So do we need to make a motion, or is that okay? Great.
All right.
Thank you, though,
Thank
for
you.
putting this together.
Yeah, this is a lot of work. So much work. Thank you so much.
Presentation's ready for DSAC, so,
Perfect.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I think the last thing we just want to bring up is our next meeting, which I believe is March 20-something. Next meeting is March 24th, and we are going to be looking at the Unified Development Ordinance, Chapter 9, Natural Resource Protection. At our last committee meeting, when we dove into this, we talked about the possibility of bringing it out to Councilmember Cox's district, seeing as this item is wholly in District B. And we discussed this ahead of the meeting, and I believe everybody's on the same page about having our next committee meeting out in the district and moving the meeting time to 7 p.m. so that we can make sure we get some good stakeholder and community engagement on this item as we dive in a little bit more. And I just want to check in with everybody and make sure that that is agreeable.
Yes. Yes.
Great. Mr. Knight? Yes. Excellent. So if staff can help us find a location and figure out all those logistics, that would be great.
We will do that, and we'll work with the clerk's office to make sure we get it noticed properly.
We're going to try it.
It could be simply announced at the table. That could be done too.
Well, we don't know where yet is the only problem.
Well, you have plenty of time between now and
Yes.
then you get until you do actually do it at second March meeting. That would still work.
Okay. Great. Heard. Thank you. All right. Anything else from the committee? Staff? All right. Thank you all so much. Meeting adjourned.